I'll get going straight away. Starting off with a quote. I've always wanted to start a presentation with a quote, so there you go. But the people that are here, we've talked about it a lot already in the conference. There's constant change happening in our industry, and the landfills are also seeing a bit of that. We're seeing what's going to happen to the landfill, which is still going to be an important part of our waste hierarchy, but obviously its role is evolving and changing, and the requirements of a landfill is changing, and what is that going to look like in the future? So why are things changing? What are the drivers around that? I've listed a couple there. I'll point to a couple there. The residual waste streams, that's something we've been talking about a bit this conference. We know aspirationally at least, or we know it's coming, we're going to see more concentrated residual waste streams being sent to our landfills as we're diverting, have diversion activities like FOGO. We get more energy from waste plants, and generally we're driving towards circularity anyway. We're going to see that more concentrated flow, and that's going to change how we design and operate these landfills. Unless you're in the US, generally environmental regulations are getting more and more stringent as the years go on, and that's going to require more and more out of us on how we operate our landfills. Again, another topic we've been talking about a lot in this conference is that increased community awareness and a very active community in our space, and they care, and there's a lot more stringent social license to operate and get things right. And a couple of those other topics I'll touch as we go along. So I was going to, put up a QR code here, get you guys to scan it, tell me what you think the future of landfill is going to look like. That would have shot me to pieces in terms of timeline. So I just asked some of my fellow landfill enthusiasts in the industry to ask them, what do they think? You guys can have a bit of a read up there. I do like the robo landfills one. That one's my favorite. Yeah, look, it's nothing new, nothing surprising. A lot of topics we've been hearing about. Where's the leadership? How do we get new projects approved in future? PFAS, what are we doing about that? So a lot of these topics I'll try and cover as we go along. And yeah, one more slide on ground rules. I only have 20 minutes here, so I do have to put some gates around what I'm going to tell you. When I say future, I mean near future, so say a 30-year horizon. I'm not going to tell you what's happening in 100 years' time, because I don't know, we might not have waste, or we're sending it in rockets to the sun. I don't know. I can't give you that answer, unfortunately. I'm focusing on the landfill itself. Obviously, we have these integrated facilities. We divert waste, we collect waste, we recycle it at these landfills, but I'm really looking at the landfill itself. Focusing more on operational sites. Obviously, there is a lot of sites that need to be closed and rehabilitated in the near future, and I guess if the economics work out, maybe we'll be mining them as well. That's a topic for another day. And I think I'm repeating myself here. I won't cover everything. I'll try and cover as much of the key issues as I can, but I'm happy to talk about it later. So it would be remiss of me not to talk about the modern landfill before I talked about the future landfill. And look, you'll have to humour me. I'm sure most people in this room know what a modern landfill looks like, but I'll quickly go over it anyway. It's a nice picture up there of one. So you have the liner system that goes around the base there. On top of that, you have a leachate drainage system, so typically gravel with pipe work. And then above that, we have the waste itself being placed in horizontal lifts with covering going on, and then eventually we put that final cap on and we seal it. In terms of leachate, we're extracting it from that drainage system and then sending it to some sort of storage solution. The picture there has tanks, but typically we use ponds out here. And then we're thinking about disposal. Are we treating it first and then sending it to sewer? Are we looking at things like irrigation? There's a number of different methods we use in Australia. From a gas point of view, if it's viable, we're extracting gas out of the system, and then typically in Australia, we're looking at, well, can we use, can we generate energy with landfill gas engines, or if that's not viable, at least we're seeing it, so say a landfill gas flare to reduce that greenhouse gas emissions footprint. So we've got, the other one we've got there is the monitoring devices there. So we have some groundwater monitoring, we have some landfill gas monitoring, we do surface water monitoring as well. So all these sorts of things that we do just to make sure that our sites are complying with their licenses and that we're able to pick up issues if they arise. So I'll start with containment. And a lot of this draws me back to, I've done a lot of designs of industrial facilities and hazardous waste facilities. And I think when we look at these concentrated residual waste streams, that is generally where we're trending. So when I look at the design side of things, for a general waste landfill at the moment, it varies slightly across Australia, but generally you're looking at a clay liner and alongside a geomembrane working in composite. If you don't have clay, you can look at an alternative like geosynthetic clay liners. But it's a pretty stock standard design. And when you're looking at these facilities, it's likely we can't just roll that out. We're going to have to think about more site-specific testing. Is it testing of the leachate quality, the waste characterization stuff? And then playing that in with how we test our materials that we're using for our liner system. So a bit more thought and refinement around how we look at that. From a component standpoint, we have these composite liners in industrial facilities. That's not enough. We have to look at what's called a double liner system. So we're effectively taking that liner and doubling it up again. And that may be required, particularly when we think about the PFAS problem we have. There's a lot of research obviously happening with PFAS at the moment. One of the big ones that's come through, there's a professor by the name of Kerry Rowe, very famous in our field. He's actually an Australian. He's a good guy. He's picked up that PFAS has a real impact on the service life of, say, geomembranes and things like that. So that sort of thing we have to think about and say, well, we can't keep doing the same thing we're doing if we know there's now a known issue in that. That being said, there's a lot of innovation happening in the field. We're seeing people come up with new products as they do when we have new problems, things that are better equipped to protect us against, say, PFAS migration and things like that. So a lot of interesting happening in the field, but it's likely to change the way we look at these lining systems. Robustness and, again, with these industrial facilities, we have what's called a leak detection layer. So between those two liner systems, you put a drainage layer there, and that way you're able to pick up leaks. If you were to have a breakthrough through your primary liner, you can pick up these leaks and be able to, as well as pick them up, you can also use that as a drainage system to be able to manage that and not let it just go straight into the environment. So those sorts of redundancy and contingency measures, that's just one. We're likely to look at more and more contingency measures because we want to make sure that we can stop things. If things invariably do go wrong, we have measures to try and limit the effects of that. And monitoring, it's relatively widespread now. If you build a landfill cell recently, we have leak location surveys that we do on our liners, and that's great stuff. It's really about validating the liner that's been installed is in line with, it's best as it can be. There are some more advancements happening, so we're putting conductive materials inside geomembranes and geotextiles just to make that liner survey as good as it can be. And again, it's all about installing a product that we're happy with and it's at its best level that it can be before we start putting waste in there. Landfill gas. So I'll be careful here because I've got Dr. North in the room, but I'll try and stay in my lane a bit. Landfill gas is a great field for incremental improvements. We've been seeing that year on year. I remember when I started in waste 15 years ago, we have landfill sites that they'd look at and say, well, it's not really viable for us to get gas out of this site. But now we can come back to these sites and say, actually, with our increased, our optimization of our extraction measures and things like that, we can now get gas out of those facilities. Things like that. We're seeing battery storage going alongside our landfill gas engines. We're seeing all sorts of improvements there. And in general, it's got a great environmental outcome in that the more gas we get out, the less fugitive emissions we're seeing get out of our system. So it's all good news there. Refinement, and look, I'm a little bit biased on this one because our company does a lot of work in this space. There's a real opportunity, we think, around converting that landfill gas into renewable natural gas. And I say that because you look over in North America and Europe, there's a lot of activity in this space. You're seeing, I think, about 110 renewable natural gas conversion facilities, either in planning or that have been built in America, and there's plenty more to come. And the reasons they're doing this, there's opportunities to reduce the emissions. You're refining that to a biomethane, essentially. And there's a lot of revenue potential putting that back in. Granted, look, that is being driven a bit by market incentives. Things like, I put some examples there around North America having low carbon fuel standards, tax credits for renewable fuels and things like that. So there is a bit of requirement of the market creating some incentive and intervention for that happening. But given what we're seeing overseas, it's very likely that that's going to happen over here as well. So that's the good stuff. I think the hardest stuff we have to think about is if we do have these more concentrated waste streams, these more residual waste streams, we're going to see a change in the amount of gas that we're going to get and also that quality of that gas. And I probably used the wrong word there, viability. I think it's more feasibility. It's just understanding, yes, we can still do these things, but we're getting less gas. We're maybe having to do more treatment because we have more hydrogen sulfide or other things like that. The cost is adding up. The revenue we're generating is getting smaller. Does that change the balance of how we look at our feasibility of these facilities? So definitely a bit of a change there. And then, yeah, PFAS, everyone loves PFAS. They've done some research recently and they found PFAS in landfill gas emissions as well. Good on you, it's just getting everywhere. Another problem, another thing that may impact our feasibility. We're going to have to come up, and I'm sure we will come up with a solution if we don't want to have one already, and the regulator is going to turn their eye to it at some point. Again, it's just another challenge to overcome. Maybe it impacts on our feasibility of how we look at these things moving forward. I've lumped in leachate and surface water into one thing, just to make it a bit simpler here. So climate change, if you're not aware, recently the Australian Rainfall and Runoff Guidelines were released an update which has climate change projections in there. It tells you how to apply that to your projects if you're, say, sizing surface water infrastructure and things like that. It's a bit of a dog's breakfast at the moment. Everyone's still trying to work out what it's actually telling us to do and how to do it. But look, we know what it means. We know we're going to see higher and more sustained peak events. We've seen it in the last couple of years with all these La Nina. It's really going to put a strain on our systems. In particular, we're going to see more leachate, obviously. We're going to have to think about increasing the size of our surface water infrastructure. And, if we're starting to look at new sites, do we have, siting constraints that we didn't have before around floodplains and sea level rising? So it's really about, thinking more into the future. You're not sizing things just for today. You're thinking about how long your facility is going to last and future-proofing it around that. So just a bit more nuance and thought around that. Again, PFAS. I guess this is maybe other people might think differently. I think it's at a bit of a standstill at the moment that everyone's cognizant we have an issue. We have PFAS in leachate. The regulator wants us to get it out. The Water Authority is saying, well, maybe it makes more sense for the landfills to be doing it. The landfills disagree. And so there's a bit of a standstill around who's going to actually deal with this problem. Putting that aside, say if PFAS removal had to happen at our landfills, we had to roll out treatment of that, it starts making you think a bit around our disposal mechanisms and saying, we're going to apply such advanced treatment to get PFAS out, to get other contaminants out. Do we even need to send it to sewer anymore? Do we have such a high quality water? Can we look at other simpler mechanisms like just irrigating on green fields or releasing to natural waters? It's something we don't really do in Australia. The regulator doesn't like that idea at all, but it is done in America and other parts of Europe as well. And potentially, we go down that path if we're having to spend so much time and money and effort on removing PFAS and other emerging contaminants. And speaking about other emerging contaminants, yeah, look, they'll keep coming. The fun will keep going. Microplastics seems to be the next big one. There's been a lot of research done that's shown that surprise, surprise, there's a lot of microplastics in our landfill leachate. So the regulator at some point will get onto that and, we'll see what that means for us. But in general, look, I think the leachate thing, I'm sure the landfill owners and operators will agree, it's a societal problem that we have. And a landfill is a repository for society's waste. So, of course, there's a concentration of leachate, of PFAS. But the issue being that we're essentially, landfill owners and operators are being penalised with this problem and having to deal with it, and also being held penalised for having to manage it. And it really should be a more nuanced conversation, a more positive dialogue around getting everyone involved and at the table and coming up with a pragmatic solution together. Aspirationally speaking, but hopefully they can do that. Yeah, again, I love the robo landfills one, so I just chucked this in. Look, we already have a lot of great technology at our landfills, anything from drone surveys to the instrumentation and control we have for leachate and landfill gas. We can run these systems basically from a computer, another country away. It's fantastic, and this will keep going. We're seeing a lot of movement from my point of view in the landfill gas monitoring market and using drones to monitor landfill gas. So hopefully that gets rolled out soon, and in the future. We're already seeing it in construction. There is some certain plant and equipment that is remote control. Do we roll that all out? Literally our landfills run by robots at some point? Maybe, maybe not. But we should really be considering these innovations. And I think the big takeaway for me is innovations and our regulations always have a bit of a balancing act. We don't want to have too strict. We want to have stringent environmental regulations, but we don't have to the point that innovation suffers, because all this stuff has the ability of improving safety and performance and compliance at our landfills if we get it done right. Yeah, I don't think I'll speak too much to this slide, because to be honest, you guys have been beaten over the head with all this stuff over the last couple of days. There's been a lot of great conversations at this conference about new waste infrastructure, how are we planning for it. I echo some of the words there about it's great to have a plan, but who's responsible for this plan? How do we have a pathway for getting to this plan? Is it reflected in our regulatory instruments when we come to go get these facilities approved? So I don't think there's too much more I'd want to add to that. I've talked a little bit there about siting. If we're going to look at new landfills, it's very unlikely to be in metropolitan areas. We're probably going to be putting them further away. How do we get the waste out there? All those sorts of challenges. getting some leadership from the state, which, we're seeing some positive leadership at this conference around that, and hopefully they keep delivering on that. How does the funding work? And social license is probably one of those big ones around, another topic that was brought up is saying, yes, the state government has a big role in this, but everyone in this room at this conference has a role in this. To me, it's a lot about saying that, portraying landfills as we want to in our industry, knowing that if we're talking about them, not necessarily demonising them, saying yes, they have a role in our waste hierarchy. It'll be a reduced role, but still an important piece of infrastructure that we have to have involved in waste management. And also our general facility operations, making sure that we're operating those things as best we can, because we all know, there's one issue at one landfill somewhere and there's a big domino effect, and all of a sudden the whole industry is impacted by that sort of stuff. Final thoughts. Look, I think nothing really groundbreaking is what I'm talking about here today. I think we're not changing completely how we look at landfills or how we manage them. We're not reinventing the wheel. It's more about that incremental change and staying ahead of the game. And I think we have a lot of opportunity to look internationally, say at North America or Europe, where they're a bit further along in their landfill journey, or even just look at general industry trends and be ahead of that. That there is that opportunity. It's like, are we taking advantage of that? I just said it, state and national leadership is important, but we all have our part to play, so let's make sure we're all doing what we can, because landfills are going to be here for the near future at the very least. Again, to talk about that balance, not only from an innovation standpoint, also pragmatic solutions like around leachate. Have we got that balance around the regulations versus where we need to get to, and just refocusing in on what are we trying to achieve? With PFAS, it frustrates me because obviously we have an environmental problem. Let's solve it. Let's reduce this impacts to human health, but it's all getting stuck in a money conversation. So it's trying to get away from that and looking at solutions. I think I started on a quote. I'll end with a quote. Failing to plan, planning to fail. I think there's already a lot of positive movement happening there, but we need to keep that momentum going. We need to keep planning. And I guess, I look at some of the planning they put up there the other day on infrastructure, and there's a lot of scenarios. Apparently now in Sydney we don't have a putrescible landfill problem anymore. Magic, but. They're looking at, you look into those scenarios and it's like, oh, we're going to, this is all going to get solved by 2 energy from waste plants, not only getting approved, but also getting constructed, a landfill expansion getting approved and constructed. It's a lot of ifs there. And I would hope that there are multiple scenarios being modelled in all these plans, and we're catering for all these multiple scenarios, because we don't want to get caught short, particularly in a field like landfills, where if we have to all of a sudden augment that, it's hard yakka to get the community on board with that. So, my final thoughts. Thank you.